If all governments deliver on their current climate policies, the world will derive no more than 28% of its energy that way by 2050, and 100% by 2207. Not 2030 or 2035, but 200 years later. Does anyone on the liberal left accept such projections, or are they a mere fabrication of the conspiratorial right-wing conservative imagination? How about the Biden administration? Biden's experts, no doubt motivated to be as optimistic as possible, project that a mere 27% of the energy produced by 2050 will be carbon dioxide free, and that full CO2 eradication cannot possibly occur until 2242. 2242, an even more dismal guesstimation, if you regard such realities as dismal, than that put forth by the International Energy Agency. And coal for the winter, leading to acute shortages. How is incentivizing people to cut down and burn trees and use coal in their fireplaces going to help reduce the dreaded atmospheric carbon load? The actual poor versus the hypothetical poor. Perhaps we'll be able to comfort ourselves here in the West with the thought that the food we take for granted will still be available at our tables. But wait, the crops that nourish our populations cannot be grown without fertilizer, loathed by green folk, and more specifically, without ammonia. And what, pray tell, is ammonia derived from? Could it be natural gas? And how many people are dependent for their daily bread on the industrial generation and consequent wide availability of ammonia? Only 3 or 4 billion. What happens to the continuous production plants responsible for making ammonia if the natural gas supplies are halted, even momentarily? They destroy themselves, as they were not designed for such an unlikely event, and they cannot be restarted. The World Bank itself has recently indicated that 222 million people are already experiencing the threat of starvation, described oh so nicely as food insecurity. The communists managed to kill 100 million in the last century with their utopian delusions. We've barely begun to implement the save the planet nightmare, and we've already placed twice that number at risk. We are told an emergency confronts us, the climate crisis. The solution? The masses will have to tighten their belts to forestall an even worse future catastrophe. It will be poor people who die first, at least. But as we have all been taught by the malevolent eco-moralizers, the planet has too many people on it anyway. Think about this while you shiver all too soon in your cold, damp, and increasingly expensive and now substandard lodgings. You and your family may well have been deemed an expendable excess. Food for thought. This is simply not acceptable. If you dare to claim the moral high ground while serving the cause of starvation, then, by my reckoning, you've placed yourself firmly in the enemy camp, and you richly deserve whatever is coming your way. In the psychological and educational arenas, too, we demoralize young people, feeding them a constant diet of concretized apocalypse, focusing particularly on tempering or even obliviating the laudable ambition of boys, hectoring them into believing that their virtue is nothing but the force that oppresses the innocent and despoils the virginal planet. Benefits of a pure vegetarian and vegan diet are dubious at best. But what of the argument that animal husbandry is killing the planet? Well, the American Environmental Protection Agency estimates that all farming produces only 11% of greenhouse gases in the US. Transportation produces 27%. Livestock accounts for 3%. And plant-based agriculture? 5%. According to the National Academy of Sciences, if we eradicated all animal-based agriculture, we'd reduce greenhouse gases by a mere 2.6%. And it is no simple matter, by the way, and perhaps impossible, to manage a diet that is sustainable in the medium to long term by merely dining on plants. Chew on that. Ex hodos, the pathway forward.
Ex hodos.
What might we do instead if we chose to be genuinely wise, instead of inflicting want and privation upon the world's poor, while failing utterly and disastrously to save the planet? We could begin by assuming here in the West that all those frightened into paralysis and enticed into tyranny by their apprehension of the pending apocalypse have bitten off more than they can properly chew, have taken on a dragon much more fire-breathing and dire than they are heroic, have failed entirely to contend with the moral hazard that comes in assuming that the faddish emergency of their overheated imaginations entitles them to the use of power and compulsion. If your apprehension of the looming catastrophe, whatever its form, has made you into a terrified authoritarian, willing to frighten and compel to get your way, you are simply not the right leader for the times. As the unconscious manifestations of your own nervous system, telling you that you are just too small for the job at hand, are clearly indicating, even to you. We could begin by dropping our appalling attitude of moral superiority toward the developing world. We could admit instead that the rest of the planet's inhabitants have the right and the responsibility to move toward the abundant material life that we have enjoyed, despite ourselves, for the last century, and feed and provision our own families. We could, finally, delegate authority to the most local possible of levels, following the principle of subsidiarity, and produce a hierarchy of responsibility that extends necessary purpose to everyone individually at the family and community and state level, and that serves as a necessary bulwark against the blind and Luciferian, prideful, intellect-based, top-down tyrannies of emergency and compulsion that will otherwise necessarily reign. We could work out our concerns with sustainability through consensus and in the spirit of voluntary association and free play, instead of relying on top-down edicts justified in principle by our misplaced existential terror and carrying with them the moral hazard of the accrual of unjustified and dangerous centralized authority. We could distribute to everyone their requisite responsibility as sovereign actors and could bring them on board with the power of a common vision, one of life more abundant, enough high-quality food for everyone, enough energy so that slavery becomes a thing of the past, enough purpose so that nihilism and decadence no longer beckon, enough reciprocity so that we live in true peace, the generous provision of education and opportunity to everyone in the world, the conviction, to say it again, that policy based on compulsion is misguided and counterproductive. We could, thereby, have our cake and eat it too, and so could everyone else. And we could work toward that in a mutual spirit of productive generosity and fair play in competition and cooperation. Or we could let the world go to hell in a handbasket, blame that disintegration on the very enemies we specified as causal in the first place, those damned capitalists, and fail to clean up our own souls as we persecute the imaginary wrongdoers responsible for the destruction of our planet, identifying the real danger. As the psychologist Carl Jung said in the aftermath of the Nazi atrocities and the use of nuclear weapons, quote, "It is becoming more and more obvious that it is not starvation, not microbes, not cancer, but man himself who is mankind's greatest danger. For the simple reason that there is no adequate protection against psychic epidemics, which are infinitely more devastating than the worst of natural catastrophes. That great man knew that technological man had a stark choice in front of him, to become as ethical as he had become powerful, and that a real hell awaited if we refused the challenge. The rate of change is accelerating. Our ability to do almost everything is doubling faster and faster. As our ability to communicate and to compute accelerates, the consequence of our inner disunity and insufficiency become ever more serious. As we become individually more powerful, in other words, we must take on more responsibility, or else. If we fail to rectify our personal pathologies of pride, envy, and the willingness to lie, we will find ourselves mired in conflict with the world, both natural and social, and in precise proportion to our refusal to check the devil within. So, we have a stark choice in front of us. We can reorient ourselves to the cause of truth, or we can act out the conflict, imposing our self-serving instrumental delusions on the world, bringing about in that manner an external apocalypse that will result in precisely the same judgment. And so, in conclusion, it's time for all of us, but especially the self-righteous moralizers, to get our individual acts together, to take on some real moral responsibility, instead of falsely broadcasting unearned virtue far and wide, and so cheaply and carelessly.
Interesting.
If you believe that every human...
What do it mean? Playing both sides. He has an understanding of wisdom and understanding of all the problems in the world and the lies, and yet somehow also playing the other side of absolute ignorance at the same time.